Today we're going to be looking at animals, specifically chordates. Most of the animals that you're familiar with are vertebrates. A humpback whale, an iguana, seahorse, cheetah, all vertebrates. And they all share a unique characteristic. And this unique characteristic that they share places them in phylum Chordata. Now let's look at the general characteristics of chordates. Well, first and foremost, to be classified as a chordate, an animal has to show four key features, at least at some point in its life. A hollow dorsal nerve cord, that's paramount. A notochord, seen in some of the organisms into adulthood, but does occur in all at one point. Pharyngeal slits, or pouches, and a tail that extends past the anus. Now, sometimes these characteristics are a part of only the embryo of an animal. They would disappear then before adulthood. All animals that have some type of backbone are a part of phylum Chordata. So having some type of backbone puts you in phylum Chordata. Now most chordates have vertebrae as a part of their backbone, but some chordates have a notochord instead. Vertebrae are segments of bone or some other hard substance that are arranged into a backbone, repeating units essentially. Whereas a notochord is a rod of tough, flexible material that runs the length of a creature's body, providing the majority of its support. All members of phylum Chordata have a notochord at some point in development, others for their entire life. Here we see an example of a chordate that has a notochord. Their notochord is going to be just under their dorsal or hollow nerve cord. They also have pharyngeal slits and a postanal tail. There are some non-vertebrate chordates. These are those that don't have vertebrae, but do have a notochord. They exist in two subphyla, which include the tunicates and the lancelets. Both are soft-bodied marine organisms. They have a notochord, a hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, and a postanal tail at some point in their life cycle, just not vertebrae. Tunicates are also known as sea squirts, and they have in their adult stage essentially a siphon that they squirt water through when they're disturbed. The name tunicate is coming from the fact they cover themselves in a leathery material or tunic, and they secrete their own tunic. They have a larval stage, and that resembles a tadpole. It would swim for a short period of time before attaching itself to something at the bottom of the ocean floor. From there, it would then develop into its adult form once it's attached to its substrate. And the adult sea squirt looks a lot like a sponge, except it has more than one opening. Here's the base anatomy of a tunicate. We can see the adult on the left, and we can see the younger part on the right. You can see that there is a tail, a notochord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and a pharynx with slits. The pharynx with numerous slits will actually persist into adulthood, whereas the rest of the categorizations that are common in chordates disappears. Lancelets are also in the subphylum, or a subphylum that does not have vertebrae. They are in the subphylum Cephalochordata. They spend most of their time buried in the sand. They also eat by filtering out food. They're primarily after phytoplankton and zooplankton, and they're common in tropical or marine environments. They are also a food item in some parts of the world. So, most of phylum Chordata are made up of members of subphylum Vertebrata. They would be true vertebrates. Of course, we have the other subphylums that include the sea squirts and the lancelets. They do not have vertebrae, but we're going to now kind of shift focus and look not at those two subphyla, but look more at phylum Chordata, specifically Vertebrata. Now, the backbone formed of vertebrae must be present from the day they are born or hatched to very staunchly put them in subphylum Vertebrata. Vertebrates have two unique protective features, a skull and a backbone. They are going to be able to protect the vertebrate's nervous system. Vertebrates have a very complex nervous system, more complex than most other organisms. It has a bodily support in its insides called an endoskeleton. So, our skeleton, for example, as a vertebrate, is inside our body. So, it's considered an endoskeleton as opposed to the exoskeleton we've been looking at for many invertebrates, such as crabs and lobsters. An endoskeleton is a skeleton on the inside of a creature's body. Now, some vertebrates, like sharks, they have endoskeletons made up of cartilage, whereas our endoskeletons are made up of bone and cartilage. So there are some variation in types or structure of endoskeleton. And endoskeletons can actually grow as the organism grows. The circulatory system for vertebrates is closed. They generally have a heart that's composed with anywhere from 2 to 4 chambers, and the heart pumps blood into arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. The arteries then branch to all parts of the body, sending blood to capillaries. Capillaries are small blood vessels where gas exchange takes place. The gas exchange occurs at tissue cells so they can get oxygen and then give their carbon dioxide to the blood. That way it can be carried away from the tissues. Blood is carried away from the tissues and back to the heart in veins. And in the lungs is where we'd see more exchange occur in pulmonary capillaries, and that it would be the location where the blood vessels get more oxygen. Vertebrate blood is red, and that's because of a certain type of protein. In red blood cells, there is the protein hemoglobin, and it contains a pigment called heme. Heme appears red. Now, when red blood cells have a lot of oxygen, they actually have a bright red color. And when red blood cells are low on oxygen, they have a darker red color. Here we can see the base nervous system as well for vertebrates. Now we can look at the left at a more complicated central nervous system that includes the brain and spinal cord. Outside the central nervous system are the peripheral nerves that branch all over the body. But we can also look at a fish. A fish also has a basic area that we would consider the brain, and it would have nerves that branch off of it. In invertebrates, we see a lot of cephalization, or the movement of sensory organs and nervous system structures, like the brain, towards the head. We also see in the nervous system of many vertebrates olfactory lobes. Olfactory lobes are the lobes of the brain that receive signals from the receptors in the nose. The cerebrum is one of the biggest parts of the brain. It's an integrator. It helps take sensory information and coordinate a creature's response to that information. Optic lobes are going to receive signals from the receptors in the eyes. A cerebellum is a lobe that's near the back of the brain, and it controls involuntary actions and refines muscle movement. And the medulla oblongata contains many vital functions, such as those of the circulatory and respiratory systems, and is going to be important for getting signals up from the spinal cord and back down to the spinal cord. Medulla oblongata specifically helps control things like respiratory rate and depth of breathing, and also whether or not your heart is beating. In most vertebrates, the left brain controls the right side of the body, and the right brain controls the left side of the body. This is called contralateralization. The left side deals more with mathematical and analytical reasoning as well as speech, whereas the right side influences spatial perception and many of the functions that affect creativity. However, the two sides do work together. And when the brain signals to different parts of the body, the signals travel down the spinal cord. Motor signals are of this type. They travel down the spinal cord to effector tissue, whereas sensory information travels up the spinal cord to the brain. Cranial and spinal nerves emanate from the brain and spinal cord respectively, and we can also talk briefly about a reflex arc, or how information is going to initiate in a receptor, travel to the spinal cord up to the brain, be processed in the brain, and then travel down the spinal cord to effector cells like muscles and glands. So with a reflex arc, you have to have a receptor to pick up on a stimulus. That receptor will then communicate to a sensory neuron and send an input to the control center, which is the brain. The brain will be the main integrator that will decide on a output signal, or motor signal to go down the spinal cord to an effector cell. Effector cells have effects, and they oftentimes include muscles that can contract and glands that can secrete. In all vertebrates, the sexes are separate. Males have testes and produce sperm, and females have ovaries and produce eggs. Internal and external fertilization do exist in vertebrates. Internal fertilization is the process by which the male places sperm inside the female's body, and that's going to be where the eggs are fertilized. Internal. External fertilization is the process by which the female lays eggs and the male fertilizes them once they are outside of the female. So both male and female with external fertilization release their gametes externally, and that's also where they're fertilized. Internal fertilization occurs in a lot of aquatic vertebrates, whereas external fertilization occurs in most land-dwelling vertebrates. Once fertilization occurs, development takes place one of three ways: oviparous development, ovoviviparous development, and viviparous development. Oviparous development is when development occurs in an egg and the egg is hatched outside the female's body. Ovoviviparous development is development that occurs in an egg that is hatched inside the female's body. And viviparous development is development that occurs inside the female, allowing the offspring to gain nutrients and vital substances from the mother through a placenta. So here we have an example of oviparous development. We can see a chicken. Oviparous animals are born generally from an egg, and the egg is hatched outside the female's body. This includes things like crocodiles and turtles and penguins, fish, snakes, and chickens. Here is ovoviviparity. This again is where the mother gives birth to young that recently hatched in her body. The young were nourished by egg yolk, not their mother. So this is where eggs do develop, but they develop inside the mother's body. And they are going to hatch very briefly right before they're born, essentially. Whereas viviparity is when embryo are nourished by the placenta, the organ which allows nutrients from the maternal blood to diffuse to the embryo and is expelled at birth. So this essentially is associated with a live birth. And that is going to be our first introduction into chordates. So make sure you watch part B as well.